You're watching 345. I'm Jason Van Loo, and this is Level 2.
With HTML5 and CSS3, you'll be coding up those websites functionally. We all know the secrets, now you can know too. So come on down to join Professor Jason Van Loo.
So it doesn't matter if you're a designer or a developer. At the end of the day, our jobs are basically the same. We want to craft rich, usable websites and web applications with an awesome user experience. So we're going to look at some styles in CSS3. Now, just like HTML5, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's rather a list of some of the more commonly used properties. So we're going to start with border radius. Now, border radius rounds the corners of an element with a defined radius value. Now, this is an awesome property because if you remember before, in order to get rounded corners on an image or a button, you would have had to do a variety of hacks or save out transparent PNGs. Now we can let CSS do the work for us. So if we had a rectangular button, now we can add rounded corners simply by using the border radius property. So in this case, we have a border radius of 10 pixels. The higher the value, the more rounded the corners are going to be. The lower the value, the less rounded the corners are going to be. Now, a quick note here, some of these CSS properties don't show up the same in every browser. Surprise, surprise. So in this case, for the border radius property, we need to add vendor prefixes for WebKit and Mozilla. So we want to put our vendor prefixes before the main CSS property. So in this case, we have WebKit border radius and Mozilla border radius before our standard border radius property. Next, let's look at text shadow. Text shadow adds a vertical and horizontal offset shadow to text, and we have the ability to control direction, blur, and the color of the shadow. Now, just like border radius, before, in order to get this effect, we would have to save out images. Now we can create shadows on text by using this property. So if we look at an example here, we have an image from designswap.com, and if you notice that the name, Phil Kaufman, that's actually text with a text shadow. So the way that we render this property is with a couple of values. First, we have the X offset value, then we have the Y offset value. Then we have the blur value. So by setting these values, we can create a variety of different shadows for our text. And then finally, we can also set the color. So one quick design note here. We all probably know how to create a drop shadow, but what if we wanted to create a letterpress effect, that is, the text being stamped into the page? Well, if we wanted to do that, something to remember is if you have a light background and dark text, you want to create a shadow that's offset bottom right with a light color. Or, as in this case, with this image, we have a darker background and light text. So we want our shadow to be offset to the top left and in a darker color. By playing around with a variety of different values with the text shadow property, you can create some pretty awesome effects in CSS. Let's move on now to box shadow. Box shadow adds a shadow to a non-text element, and it basically follows the same syntax as text shadow. So as we see in our example here, we have an image with a shadow that we can create in CSS as opposed to just saving out an image. So in this case, we have our X offset value, our Y offset value, and our blur. Now, one neat thing about box shadow is we can also add an inset property. If we wanted the shadow to be inside of the image as opposed to outside of the image, we can use inset with the same syntax. So next, let's look at RGBA. Now, RGBA isn't a new CS property, but rather it's a new model for defining color in our style sheet. Now, previously, we would use hex colors to define our colors in our style sheet. But hex colors didn't give us the option of defining opacity. Now with RGBA, we can add an opacity value to our colors to allow them to be more transparent. So as we see here, with this property, we have our RGBA values, red, green, and blue, and then the last value here, 0.5, is our opacity value. So in this case, we can allow colors or background imagery to actually bleed through our text to create a pretty neat effect. Let's also look at HSLA, which is an alternative model for defining colors in our style sheet. Now, HSLA is preferred by some because it's a little bit easier to change out the values of the colors if you don't have RGB values. And if you're wanting to make changes to your colors on the fly, then this might be a good property for you to use. So it follows a similar syntax to RGBA. Let's look and see how that works. We have our HSLA values, which translate to hue, saturation, and light respectively. And then just like opacity, we have an alpha transparency value. So we can set that to be as opaque as we want it. Now, some of you may not know how to find the HSLA color values. Well, we can actually use Photoshop. In Photoshop, we can pull the HSB values, but sometimes these aren't always reliable. I actually like to use Matt Pattenoud's Colors app, which you can pull the HSLA values directly and import them into your style sheet. Or, Chris Coyier has a pretty slick interface called the HSLA Explorer, which allows you to pull HSLA values directly. Next, let's move on to the opacity property. The opacity property defines how opaque an image or an object can be. So we've talked about RGBA and HSLA for text. Now let's talk about opacity for images. So in this case, we can set the opacity of an image by using this property. This is nice because now we don't have to save out transparent images. Instead, we could save out full images and then adjust the opacity using CSS. This gives us a lot more variety and makes it easier for us to change values. Next, let's look at the CSS transform property. The CSS transform property allows elements rendered by CSS to be transformed in two-dimensional space. So this is commonly used maybe on a hover state for an image if we wanted that image to break out of its space without affecting the surrounding elements. Dan Cederholm does this on the popular site Dribbble, and we can see here with his color tags. So the blue on the hover state actually pops out of the surrounding elements but doesn't negatively affect them. So here's what the code might look like. We have an unordered list, and then on hover we set our CSS transform property. Now notice we have vendor prefixes in this property as well. We've also added a vendor prefix for Opera. Now we don't always have to add a vendor prefix for Opera, but in this case we do. So we've chosen to use the scale property for this CSS transform, and basically what that means is we're going to be scaling the image by 50%. We could also use one of the other three properties available, rotate, skew, or translate, which moves the image along the X and Y axes. Next, let's look at CSS transitions. CSS transitions allow property changes in CSS values to occur smoothly over a specified duration. Basically what this means is we can create some pretty cool transition or rollover effects without using JavaScript. So if we had a button that we wanted to add a transformation to and not just a hover state, we could do that. Now we're going to get into the CSS transition property a little bit more in depth later on in the course, so bear with me there. Next, let's look at CSS gradients. CSS gradients create a transition from one color to another without the use of images. So we all should be familiar with how to create a gradient for a button, say in Photoshop, but this makes it super easy to create gradients in CSS. Once again, gives you a ton of variety and allows you to change elements on the fly. So we have our sample image here, That's No Moon. Now the syntax for this property is a little unintuitive and it actually renders differently in each browser. So I found that the easiest way to generate CSS gradients is to use a pretty cool little tool from John Alsop. He's created an editor in which you can just input your colors and it automatically spits out the CSS code that you need to put in your style sheet. So in this case, for our That's No Moon button, here's how we would generate the CSS. We have our background image property, and instead of including an image URL, we've actually set a gradient. So you'll notice we have a WebKit vendor prefix here as well as a Mozilla vendor prefix. And you can see how they're different. But basically we've created a gradient with a button with rounded corners simply using CSS. Pretty cool. The multiple backgrounds property allows us to add multiple background images to our page or within our page. In this example from Naz Hamid's Lost Worlds Fair site, he's actually added a couple of background images so that as you're scrolling down the page, the different images move at a different rate. So it almost gives a parallax effect. So here's what the code might look like from Naz's site. He's actually got two images in this case. bg.jpg, and tile.jpg. Now, what you want to remember is the image closest to the user on the screen needs to be listed first in your image stack. So in this case, that would be background.jpg. My friend Dan Higby has recently done this in one of his blog posts. He's added multiple background images, so as you scroll down the page and read more of his post, the background image changes, and it also moves because he's got a variety of background images within each section. You really can create a lot of neat effects using this property. Now we're going to look at real fonts on the web. Now, if you remember the old days, we were limited to just a few safe fonts: Arial, Helvetica, Georgia, or Times New Roman. Well, now the age of rich internet typography is here, and we have a ton of options when it comes to embedding fonts on our website. Now, there are several different varieties of fonts that we can use on our websites. Andy Clark has created a pretty helpful table in his Hard-Boiled Web Design book. Some of the more common fonts are OpenType or TrueType. We also have the Web Open Font format, which is kind of like a compressed file of OpenType and TrueType fonts. So with the compressed file size as well as additional security features, I think we'll start seeing this become more of the norm in browser-supported fonts. Now, CSS3 gives us a property for using real fonts in our style sheets. It's called @FontFace. In FontFace, we have three values that we need to declare in our style sheet. The first is a font file. The second is an @FontFace declaration, where we'll list the font family, the source, and the format of that font. And then finally, we can include that font in our font stack. Now, an easy way of doing this is to go to a website called Font Squirrel, which has a variety of free-to-use fonts, and they also generate the @FontFace properties for you. So all you need to do is copy and paste, put those at the top of your style sheet, and you're good to go. Now, the @FontFace property is still the most reliable way, in my opinion, of embedding fonts into your website. But in the past year, we've seen a number of new startups really advancing the technology in web typography. We have Typekit, we have webfonts.fonts.com, and then we also have Google getting into the mix with Google Fonts. So now you have a variety of options when it comes to rich web typography. The bottom line is we're no longer limited to the old safe fonts. We have a number of different options when it comes to embedding real fonts into our website. It takes a little bit of extra work and preparation, but the results and the overall user experience is much more positive. Now, as designers and developers, we know that our sites might not look the same in every browser, but that's okay. Now, notice I didn't say it was okay for our sites to look broken, but we understand that there might be small variances from browser to browser. And as long as we're creating adequate fallbacks in our style sheets and in our markup, we can use some of these new features to create rich experiences for our users. Now, when it comes to browser compatibility, Dan Cederholm has put together a helpful table in his book CSS3 for Web Designers. He lists out the main CSS3 properties and how they're supported in today's contemporary browsers. Now, you'll notice that Internet Explorer 9 is the only version of IE that currently supports a lot of these CSS3 properties, with the exception of text shadow. So you want to make sure, in particular if you're looking to support IE8 or below, that you're providing fallback properties in your CSS style sheets. But let me also say this, as great as CSS3 and HTML5 are, we haven't arrived. And it's our job as designers and developers to make sure that we're putting the user first and creating experiences that are going to be positive for our users. So just because we have elements that we can use doesn't mean that we should. Remember, the most valuable tool in your creative arsenal is your mind. So think through how you want to design and how you want to develop sites, and use some of these properties where you think they're necessary. As craftsmen of the web, our job is to use the tools at our disposal to create the best experience possible for our users. Now, users probably won't know that you've used some of these specific elements in CSS3, but that's okay. As long as they're functioning properly, they're going to have a great experience. But if they have a negative experience, they're not going to care if you use text shadow or RGBA values. All they're going to care about is the experience that they have when visiting your website. So make sure that you design responsibly, that you're taking everything into consideration and always putting your users first. So now it's time to apply what you've learned in this level. Let's get to coding.